Evelyn Harper sat at her dining table, a half-empty cup of tea growing cold beside her. She glanced out of the window, her gaze fixed on the serene suburban street, lined with neatly trimmed lawns and blooming flower beds. The neighborhood was as picturesque as a postcard, but to Evelyn, it felt hollow. The house was a generous gift from her daughter, Naomi, and son-in-law, Michael. They had insisted she needed a fresh start after the loss of her husband, and the bustling city she once called home no longer seemed right for her. "You'll love it, Mom," Naomi had said with her usual enthusiasm. "It's peaceful, safe, and just what you need." Now, 2 weeks later, Evelyn wasn't so sure. The silence felt deafening, the stillness suffocating. She missed the noise of the city, the laughter of her old friends, and the memories that clung to every corner of her old apartment. Here, everything was pristine but unfamiliar, like a life she hadn't earned. She sipped her tea, trying to shake the melancholy. Today was supposed to be exciting. New furniture was being delivered, and the house would finally feel more like home. Evelyn had spent the morning cleaning in preparation, vacuuming the bare floors and dusting the empty shelves. As she worked, her thoughts wandered to the past. Her son, David, came to mind, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in years. David had always been a free spirit, but somewhere along the way, freedom turned to recklessness. His poor choices had strained their relationship, culminating in a betrayal Evelyn couldn't forgive. The memory made her chest tighten, and she quickly pushed it aside. The sound of a delivery truck pulling into her driveway snapped her out of her thoughts. Evelyn wiped her hands on her apron and hurried to the door. 2 delivery workers were unloading boxes from the truck, their efficiency a sharp contrast to her slow, deliberate movements. "Good morning," she greeted them with a smile. "Morning, ma'am," one of the men replied, glancing at a clipboard. "We've got your dining set, a coffee table, and a cabinet. Where do you want them?" Evelyn directed them to the living room and watched as they worked. The furniture was unassembled, and the men moved quickly to set everything up. The rhythmic clang of tools filled the air, momentarily breaking the silence of the house. For a brief moment, Evelyn allowed herself to feel hopeful. The house was starting to look like a home, and maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to belong here. Then, a knock at the door shattered her thoughts. It wasn't a loud knock, more of a timid tap, but it startled her nonetheless. Evelyn frowned, glancing at the workers, who were too busy to notice. She walked to the door and opened it slowly, unsure of what to expect. Standing on her porch was a young boy, no older than 10 or 11. He was small and wiry, with messy black hair and wide, tear-filled eyes. His clothes were worn and slightly too big, as if they had been handed down from an older sibling. In his trembling hands, he held a shoebox. "Please," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please help me." Evelyn's heart clenched. She opened the door wider and crouched to meet the boy's eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Are you lost?" The boy shook his head violently, tears spilling onto his cheeks. "No, my sister. She's in here," he said, holding up the shoebox. "Please, she needs help." Evelyn stared at the box, her mind racing. What could he mean? She glanced over her shoulder at the delivery workers, who were still oblivious to the scene unfolding outside. "Come in," she said, ushering the boy inside and closing the door behind him. The boy hesitated, clutching the shoebox tightly. His small frame was trembling, and Evelyn could see the fear in his eyes. She guided him to the couch and sat beside him, her voice calm and soothing. "It's okay," she said. "You're safe now. Let me help you." The boy slowly opened the shoebox, and Evelyn gasped. Inside, nestled among layers of torn cloth, was a tiny newborn baby. The baby's skin was pale, and her breaths were shallow but steady. Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth as a wave of panic and protectiveness washed over her. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. "What happened? Where are your parents?" The boy sniffled, his voice shaky. "My stepdad, he hurt my mom. She told me to take my sister and run. I hid her in the box so he wouldn't find her." Evelyn felt her stomach drop. The boy's words painted a picture of terror and desperation, and she knew she couldn't ignore it. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling. "I'm calling for help," she said firmly. What's your name? Mateo, the boy replied. Okay, Mateo. Stay here with your sister. I'll get someone to help. As Evelyn dialed 911, she couldn't shake the feeling that her quiet life had just taken a turn she could never have anticipated. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she gripped the phone, dialing 911. Her heart raced with every second that passed, the reality of the situation sinking in. She stole a glance at Mateo, who sat hunched over on the couch, clutching his baby sister like his life depended on it. The shoebox, now empty, rested on the coffee table. 911. What's your emergency? A calm voice answered. This is Evelyn Harper, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. A young boy just showed up at my door with a baby, his sister. He says their stepfather hurt their mother. I think the children are in danger. The dispatcher's voice grew serious. Can you confirm your address, ma'am? Evelyn gave the details, her eyes never leaving Mateo. She could see his small body shaking, his hands trembling as he stroked the baby's cheek to soothe her. Stay on the line, ma'am, the dispatcher instructed. Officers are on their way. Is the stepfather nearby? I don't know, Evelyn whispered, her voice dropping as if the man might hear her from miles away. The boy said he ran away. Keep the children inside. Don't open the door for anyone except the police. Evelyn nodded, even though the dispatcher couldn't see her. Thank you, she said softly before ending the call. She placed the phone on the table and knelt beside Mateo. The police are coming, she said gently. They'll help you and your sister. Mateo's wide, tear-filled eyes looked up at her. What if he finds us? He whispered. Evelyn reached out, hesitating for a moment before placing her hand on his. I won't let that happen, she promised. You're safe here. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper. Evelyn leaned closer, her maternal instincts kicking in. What's her name? She asked. Emma, Mateo said, his voice barely audible. She's beautiful, Evelyn said, her voice warm but tinged with sadness. How old is she? 3 days, Mateo replied, his lips trembling. Evelyn's heart broke at the thought of a child this young being dragged into such a nightmare. She wanted to ask more, but a sudden knock at the door made her jump. The knock was loud and forceful, sending a jolt of fear through her chest. Evelyn's first instinct was to protect the children. She motioned for Mateo to stay quiet and scooped up Emma, cradling her protectively. Stay here, she whispered to Mateo. Slowly, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. Her blood ran cold. A tall, broad-shouldered man stood on her porch, his face twisted with frustration and barely restrained anger. He banged on the door again, harder this time. I know you've got my kids in there, the man shouted. Open the door. Evelyn's mind raced. This had to be Caleb, the stepfather Mateo had mentioned. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Open the door, or I'll break it down. Caleb bellowed, his fists pounding against the wood. Evelyn's hands shook as she reached for her phone again, dialing 911 for the second time. He's here, she whispered when the dispatcher answered. The stepfather. He's outside my door. He's trying to get in. Stay calm, ma'am, the dispatcher said. Officers are on their way. Do not engage with him. Evelyn ended the call and turned to Mateo. Go upstairs, she whispered urgently. Take Emma and hide. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. Mateo hesitated, fear etched across his face. But what about you? I'll be fine, Evelyn assured him. Go now. Reluctantly, Mateo scooped up his sister and ran toward the staircase. Evelyn waited until she heard their footsteps fade before she turned back to the door. Go away, she shouted, her voice stronger than she expected. The police are on their way. Caleb let out a bitter laugh. The police? You think they're going to help you? You don't know who you're dealing with, lady. Evelyn didn't respond. She stood frozen in place, every nerve in her body on edge. The pounding on the door grew louder, and she prayed the police would arrive before Caleb carried out his threat. Then, suddenly, the banging stopped. Silence filled the air, thick and oppressive. Evelyn held her breath, listening for any sign of movement. She peeked through the peephole again, but Caleb was gone. A wave of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. A crash from the back of the house made her jump. Caleb had found another way in. Evelyn grabbed a heavy lamp from the side table, clutching it tightly as she moved toward the kitchen. Her hands shook, but her resolve was firm. She wouldn't let him hurt those children. She rounded the corner and froze. Caleb was standing in the kitchen, his eyes locking onto hers like a predator spotting prey. "Where are they?" he demanded, his voice low and menacing. Evelyn tightened her grip on the lamp. "The police are coming," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Caleb took a step closer, his fists clenched. "You've got no idea what you're messing with, old lady. Give me the kids, and I'll be on my way." Evelyn didn't move. "You're not taking them," she said firmly. The tension in the room was suffocating. Caleb's eyes darted to the side as the faint sound of sirens filled the air. He let out a frustrated growl and backed toward the door. "This isn't over," he spat before slipping out the back. Evelyn sank to the floor, her hands trembling as she heard the front door burst open. The police had arrived. "Ma'am, are you okay?" one of the officers asked, rushing to her side. Evelyn nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "The children, they're upstairs?" The officers moved quickly, securing the house and checking on Mateo and Emma. Evelyn sat on the floor, her heart still racing. She knew this was only the beginning. Evelyn sat on the edge of her couch, still clutching the heavy lamp she had used as a makeshift weapon. The cold metal felt like her only connection to reality. Her heart was pounding in her chest, the adrenaline refusing to subside. The front door swung open with a burst of energy, and two police officers stormed in, their presence immediately filling the room with a sense of authority. "Ma'am, are you all right?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but firm. Evelyn nodded weakly, lowering the lamp. "He was here," she said, her voice trembling. "The stepfather. He broke in through the back." The officer motioned to his partner, who moved toward the kitchen to inspect the broken door. "Did he hurt you? Are the children safe?" "They're upstairs," Evelyn replied, pointing toward the staircase. "I told them to hide." The officer's expression softened. "Good thinking, ma'am. We'll check on them. Sit tight." Evelyn nodded, sinking deeper into the couch as the officer ascended the stairs. Her hands were still trembling, and she clutched them together tightly to steady herself. Within moments, the officer returned, Mateo trailing behind him with Emma cradled protectively in his arms. The baby was fussing quietly, her tiny hands grasping at the blanket Mateo had wrapped her in. "They're okay," the officer said, his voice reassuring. "No injuries." Evelyn exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She opened her arms, and Mateo hesitated before stepping closer, letting her pull him and Emma into a gentle hug. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're so brave, Mateo." The officer cleared his throat, drawing Evelyn's attention. "We've secured the area, but the suspect fled before we arrived. We'll put out an alert and increase patrols in the neighborhood." Evelyn's stomach sank. "He's still out there?" "For now," the officer admitted, his tone regretful. "But we'll find him. In the meantime, do you have a safe place to go?" Evelyn looked at Mateo and Emma, then back at the officer. "This is their safe place," she said firmly. "I'm not leaving them." The officer nodded, respecting her determination. "Understood. We'll station a patrol car outside tonight, just in case. In the meantime, I need you to tell me exactly what happened." The account. Evelyn recounted the events of the evening, from Mateo's arrival at her door to Caleb's threats and eventual break-in. She described his menacing demeanor, his demands for the children, and the sheer terror of facing him alone. The officer took detailed notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Evelyn's voice shook as she spoke, but she pushed through, determined to give the police everything they needed to stop Caleb. When she finished, the officer set down his notebook. "Thank you, Mrs. Harper. You did everything right. But I have to ask, do you know this man? Have you ever seen him before today?" Evelyn shook her head. "No. Mateo and Emma just showed up here. I'd never met them before tonight." The officer glanced at Mateo, who was sitting quietly on the couch, his arms wrapped protectively around Emma. "Mateo," the officer said gently, kneeling to meet the boy's eye level. Can you tell me what happened before you came here? Mateo looked at Evelyn, as if asking for permission. She gave him an encouraging nod. It's okay, sweetheart, she said softly. You can tell him. Mateo hesitated, his small hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb, he was yelling at my mom, Mateo began. He was really mad. Mom just had Emma, and she was tired. She told him to stop, but he got really angry. He hit her. The officer's expression remained calm, but Evelyn could see the tension in his jaw. What happened next? Mom told me to take Emma and run, Mateo continued, his voice breaking. She said to find someone who could help us. So I grabbed Emma and put her in the box to keep her safe. I ran out the back door, and I just kept running. Evelyn placed a comforting hand on Mateo's shoulder as tears streamed down his face. You did the right thing, she said firmly. You saved your sister. The officer nodded. You were very brave, Mateo. And you're safe now, okay? We're going to do everything we can to protect you and your sister. Doubt and disbelief. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway made Evelyn tense. Another officer entered the house, leading Caleb in handcuffs. His shirt was torn, and a cut above his eyebrow suggested he hadn't gone quietly. Evelyn's relief was short-lived as Caleb's demeanor changed the moment he saw her. He straightened his posture, a slick smile spreading across his face. Officers, this is a misunderstanding, Caleb said smoothly. That boy has an overactive imagination. He's always making up stories to get attention. Evelyn's mouth fell open in disbelief. You broke into my house, she snapped. Caleb's expression darkened for a split second before he regained his composure. I was looking for my kids, he said, his tone calm and measured. I thought they were in danger. I didn't mean to scare anyone. The officer holding Caleb's arm tightened his grip. You'll have your chance to explain yourself at the station, he said curtly. Caleb's smile didn't waver, but his eyes locked onto Evelyn's with a cold intensity that sent a chill down her spine. A frustrating reality. After Caleb was escorted away, Evelyn turned to the officer who remained behind. He's lying, she said, her voice shaking with anger. He's dangerous. We believe you, Mrs. Harper, the officer assured her. But the law requires us to investigate all sides. For now, we'll keep him in custody while we gather evidence. Evelyn's shoulders slumped. She felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. What about Mateo and Emma? She asked. We'll need to notify Child Protective Services, the officer said carefully. They'll determine the best course of action. No, Evelyn said firmly. They're staying with me. The officer hesitated. That decision will be up to CPS, but I'll make a note of your willingness to care for them. As the officer left, Evelyn sat back down on the couch, pulling Mateo and Emma close. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. She wasn't giving up on these children. Evelyn woke up the next morning to the sound of soft crying. It took her a moment to register where she was and why her heart felt so heavy. The events of the previous night crashed down on her like a wave, bringing with them the memories of Mateo's frightened face and the tiny weight of Emma in her arms. The crying was coming from the couch. Evelyn found Mateo sitting there, holding Emma as tears rolled down his cheeks. The baby fussed in his arms, her small hands waving weakly. Mateo, Evelyn said softly, kneeling beside him. What's wrong, sweetheart? She's hungry, Mateo whispered. I don't know what to do. Evelyn's heart clenched. It's okay, she said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. We'll figure it out. She moved quickly, rummaging through the kitchen for anything that might help. There was no formula, no bottles, nothing for a baby so young. Evelyn felt a pang of guilt for not being better prepared. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Naomi. Evelyn hesitated before answering, unsure if her daughter would understand the situation. Hi, Mom. Naomi's voice chirped on the other end. Just checking in. How's the new house? Evelyn took a deep breath. Naomi, I need your help. There was a pause. What's wrong? Naomi asked, her tone shifting to concern. I've got 2 children here, Evelyn said, her words tumbling out. A boy and his baby sister. They're in trouble, Naomi. Their stepfather. He's dangerous. I don't know what to do. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. Mom, Naomi said finally, her voice measured. Are you saying you're sheltering someone else's kids? Without permission? They came to me for help. Evelyn shot back, her frustration boiling over. The baby is 3 days old, Naomi. She's starving. And the boy, he's terrified of that man. I couldn't just turn them away. Naomi sighed. Mom, this sounds complicated. Maybe you should call Child Protective Services. Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. I did. They're coming today. But these children need more than bureaucracy right now. They need someone who cares. Naomi's silence spoke volumes. I'll see if Michael can get some supplies, she said finally. But, Mom, be careful. You're not young anymore. You can't handle a situation like this on your own. Evelyn bit back a sharp retort and forced her voice to remain calm. Thank you, Naomi. A system that fails. By mid-morning, an agent from Child Protective Services arrived. Evelyn opened the door to a stern-faced woman in a navy suit. Her badge read Karen Fletcher, and her clipboard suggested a no-nonsense approach. Mrs. Harper? The woman asked. Yes, Evelyn replied, stepping aside. Come in. Karen's eyes swept the room, landing on Mateo and Emma. Mateo stiffened under her gaze, clutching Emma tightly. I understand these are the children in question? Karen asked, her tone brisk. They are, Evelyn said. Mateo and Emma, their stepfather. Let's stick to the facts, Mrs. Harper, Karen interrupted, scribbling something on her clipboard. How long have they been here? Since last night, Evelyn said, her frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Karen nodded and crouched in front of Mateo. Hi, Mateo. My name is Karen. I'm here to help you and your sister. Can you tell me about your stepfather? Mateo didn't answer. He buried his face in Emma's blanket, his shoulders trembling. He's scared, Evelyn said, stepping in. He's been through a lot. Karen straightened and adjusted her glasses. I understand, Mrs. Harper, but we have procedures to follow. These children need to be placed in a licensed foster home while we investigate. No. Evelyn's voice was sharper than she intended. They're safe here. I can take care of them. Karen's expression softened slightly, but her tone remained firm. I appreciate your concern, but this isn't about what's convenient. It's about what's best for the children. Evelyn felt a surge of anger. And you think ripping them away from someone they trust is best? Karen sighed. I'll take your willingness into account, but fostering requires approval. For now, I'll make arrangements to have them placed temporarily. Mateo's head shot up. No, he cried, clutching Emma tighter. Please don't take us away. Evelyn knelt beside him, her voice soft but determined. You're not going anywhere, sweetheart. I promise. Karen opened her mouth to object, but the sound of a car pulling into the driveway interrupted her. Evelyn glanced out the window and froze. It was Caleb, a brazen threat. Evelyn's stomach churned as Caleb stepped out of the car. His cocky grin and confident stride made her skin crawl. Karen frowned, following Evelyn's gaze. Is that him? Karen asked. Yes, Evelyn whispered. Karen straightened, her professional demeanor unshaken. Stay inside. I'll handle this. Evelyn watched anxiously as Karen opened the door and stepped onto the porch. Caleb's expression darkened when he saw her. Who are you? He demanded. I'm Karen Fletcher, Child Protective Services, she replied evenly. I'm here to assess the welfare of these children. Caleb's jaw tightened. Those are my kids. I've got every right to take them. Karen didn't flinch. Sir, the children will remain under protective custody until our investigation is complete. If you have concerns, I suggest you contact our office. Caleb's hands balled into fists. You people don't know what you're talking about, he snarled. That boy is a liar, and that old woman is filling his head with nonsense. Karen stepped closer, her voice low and firm. If you continue to threaten or intimidate, I'll have the police involved again. Do you understand me, Mr. Carson? Caleb glared at her, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. Without another word, he turned and stormed back to his car. Evelyn let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding as he sped away. A vow to fight. Back inside, Karen faced Evelyn, her expression more serious than ever. "He won't stop," she said bluntly. "Men like that rarely do." "I'll do whatever it takes to keep these children safe," Evelyn replied. Karen studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll file for an emergency order to keep them here with you. It's unconventional, but it's clear they trust you. In the meantime, stay vigilant. And if he comes back, don't hesitate to call the police." As Karen left, Evelyn sank onto the couch, pulling Mateo and Emma close. She could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on her, but she refused to give in to fear. She had made a promise, to Mateo, to Emma, and to herself. She wouldn't let Caleb win. The house had grown eerily quiet after Karen left. Evelyn sat at the dining table, her hands clasped tightly together as she stared out the window. Mateo was upstairs with Emma, the sound of his soft humming barely audible through the closed door. Evelyn knew Caleb wasn't gone for good. Men like him never walked away without a fight. The memory of his dark eyes, full of fury and entitlement, made her stomach churn. She didn't need Karen's warning to know that this was far from over. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her thoughts. It was Naomi. "Mom." Naomi's voice came through, hesitant. "Michael and I dropped off some supplies outside your door. Formula, bottles, diapers, the basics. I didn't want to disturb you, so I didn't knock." "Thank you," Evelyn said, her voice soft but weary. There was a pause. "Mom, are you sure you want to do this? You're taking on a lot. And Caleb, he sounds dangerous." "I'm sure," Evelyn replied firmly. "These children need someone to fight for them. If it were my grandkids, I'd hope someone would do the same." Naomi sighed. "Just be careful, okay? Call me if you need anything." Evelyn hung up and went to the front door, opening it cautiously. True to Naomi's word, a box of supplies sat neatly on the porch. Evelyn brought it inside, grateful for the small moment of kindness in an otherwise chaotic day. An uneasy peace. The afternoon passed in a tense stillness. Mateo helped Evelyn feed Emma, holding the bottle with steady hands while Evelyn marveled at his quiet strength. For someone so young, he carried a burden no child should ever have to bear. "Do you think she's okay?" Mateo asked suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn frowned. "Who, sweetheart?" "My mom," Mateo said, his eyes downcast. "Do you think she's still alive?" Evelyn's heart broke at the question. She wanted to reassure him, to promise him that his mother would be fine, but the truth weighed heavily on her. "I don't know," she admitted softly, "but the doctors will do everything they can to help her." Mateo nodded, though his expression remained somber. He turned his attention back to Emma, gently stroking her tiny hand. Evelyn watched him, a fierce determination building within her. These children had already lost so much. She wouldn't let Caleb take anything else from them. Caleb returns. That night, as Evelyn tucked Mateo into the guest room bed, a noise outside made her freeze. It was faint at first, the crunch of gravel under heavy boots. Then came the unmistakable sound of someone jiggling the back door handle. Evelyn's heart leapt into her throat. She placed a finger to her lips, signaling for Mateo to stay quiet, and crept out of the room. Grabbing her phone, she dialed 911 as she moved cautiously toward the kitchen. "This is Evelyn Harper," she whispered. "He's here. Caleb. He's trying to get in." The dispatcher's voice was calm but urgent. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Officers are on their way. Can you secure yourself and the children in a safe location?" Evelyn glanced at the door. The handle was rattling more aggressively now, and she could hear Caleb muttering angrily to himself. She backed away slowly, her pulse racing. "I'll try," she said, clutching the phone tightly. She hurried back to the guest room, ushering Mateo out of bed. "We need to hide," she whispered. "Quietly now." Mateo grabbed Emma's shoebox and followed Evelyn to the upstairs bathroom. She locked the door behind them and placed a trembling hand on Mateo's shoulder. "Stay here," she said firmly. "No matter what happens, don't come out until I say it's safe." "But," Mateo started to protest, his voice quivering. "No buts," Evelyn said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Promise me." Mateo nodded, tears brimming in his eyes as he clutched Emma tightly. Face to face, Evelyn crept back downstairs, her heart pounding in her ears. The rattling had stopped, replaced by the ominous sound of Caleb's footsteps circling the house. "Come on, old lady," Caleb's voice called out, laced with venom. "You know you can't keep them from me. Open the door, and I'll make this easy for you." Evelyn grabbed the lamp from the side table, the same one she had held the night before. Her grip was tight, her knuckles white. "You're not getting in," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "The police are on their way." Caleb laughed, a low, menacing sound. "You really think they scare me? I've dealt with worse than a couple of rent-a-cops." The sound of breaking glass made Evelyn jump. Caleb had smashed the kitchen window. She heard him climbing through, the scrape of his boots against the counter. Evelyn stood her ground, gripping the lamp like a lifeline. When Caleb appeared in the doorway, his face twisted with fury, she raised it high. "Get out," she said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her. Caleb sneered. "You're brave. I'll give you that," he said, taking a step closer. "But you're not going to stop me." Evelyn didn't hesitate. She swung the lamp with all her strength, catching Caleb square in the shoulder. He stumbled back, cursing loudly, but the blow only seemed to fuel his anger. Before he could recover, the sound of sirens filled the air. Caleb froze, his eyes darting toward the front window. "You got lucky," he spat, retreating toward the broken kitchen window. "But this isn't over." He climbed out just as the red and blue lights flooded the driveway. A small victory. The officers entered the house moments later, their presence bringing an immediate sense of relief. Evelyn lowered the lamp, her arms trembling from the effort. "He broke in again," she said, her voice shaky. "He was going to take the children." The lead officer nodded. "We've got patrols searching for him now. Are you hurt?" "No," Evelyn replied, "but I'm worried about Mateo and Emma. This isn't going to stop, is it?" The officer's expression was grim. "Not until he's behind bars." As the officers secured the house and gathered evidence, Evelyn went back upstairs to check on Mateo and Emma. She found them huddled together in the bathroom, their faces pale with fear. "It's okay," she said softly, kneeling beside them. "He's gone for now." Mateo clung to her, his small body trembling. Evelyn held him close, stroking his hair as tears filled her own eyes. In that moment, she made a silent vow. No matter what it took, she would protect these children. Caleb might be relentless, but so was she. The next morning, Evelyn sat at the dining table with a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. The rich aroma filled the room, but she barely noticed. Her thoughts were consumed by the events of the night before and the battle she knew was far from over. Across the room, Mateo sat on the couch, cradling Emma. The baby had just been fed and was now dozing peacefully in his arms. Evelyn marveled at his tenderness, the way he instinctively knew how to calm her despite his own fears. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. The caller ID showed an unfamiliar number. "Hello?" Evelyn answered cautiously. "Mrs. Harper, this is Karen Fletcher from Child Protective Services." Evelyn sat up straighter. "Yes, Miss Fletcher. Is there news?" "I've reviewed your request to care for Mateo and Emma temporarily," Karen said, her tone professional but not unkind. "Given the circumstances, I've expedited the emergency placement process. For now, the children will remain with you." Relief washed over Evelyn. "Thank you," she said softly. "Thank you so much." "But," Karen continued, "this is just the first step. There will be a formal hearing to determine the children's long-term placement. Caleb is their legal guardian, and he's already petitioning for their return." Evelyn's grip on the phone tightened. "That man is dangerous. You've seen what he's capable of." "I agree," Karen said, her voice firm, "but the law requires us to consider all evidence. You'll need to present a compelling case to prove Caleb is unfit." "I'll do whatever it takes," Evelyn said, her resolve hardening, preparing for battle. That afternoon, Evelyn called her daughter Naomi. "I need your help," she said. Naomi hesitated. "Mom, are you sure about this? Fighting for custody, it's not going to be easy. And Caleb, he won't make it easy for you." I don't care how hard it is, Evelyn said firmly. These children need me. They deserve a safe home. Naomi sighed. Okay, Michael and I will help however we can. Let's start by finding a good lawyer. Over the next few days, Evelyn threw herself into preparation. With Naomi's help, she hired an attorney named Laura Connors, a sharp, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for taking on difficult cases. Laura met with Evelyn at the house to discuss the case. You've got an uphill battle, Laura said, her tone blunt but not discouraging. The court system prioritizes keeping children with their biological family whenever possible. We'll need to prove that Caleb is a threat to their safety. He is, Evelyn said. He's abusive. Mateo told me everything. And he broke into this house twice. Good, Laura said, jotting notes on her pad. We'll use that, along with police reports and witness testimony. But it won't be enough on its own. Do you have anyone who can vouch for your ability to care for the children? Evelyn hesitated. I don't have many connections here. My daughter and son-in-law can speak for me, but beyond that, Laura nodded. It's a start. I'll handle the legal strategy, but you'll need to prepare yourself for the emotional toll. Custody battles can get ugly, and Caleb will likely use every trick in the book to discredit you. Evelyn straightened her shoulders. Let him try. My priority is Mateo and Emma. Caleb's escalation. The days leading up to the hearing were tense. Evelyn remained vigilant, keeping the doors locked and the curtains drawn. The patrol car stationed outside offered some reassurance, but Caleb's threats lingered in the back of her mind. One evening, as Evelyn was tucking Mateo into bed, he looked up at her with wide, anxious eyes. Do you think he'll take us away? He asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn knelt beside him, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Not if I can help it, she said firmly. I'm going to fight for you and Emma. You're safe here. Mateo nodded, but the fear in his eyes didn't fade. Later that night, Evelyn was jolted awake by the sound of glass shattering. She rushed downstairs to find the living room window broken, a brick lying amidst the shards. Taped to it was a crude note scrawled in angry, uneven handwriting. You can't keep them from me. Evelyn's hands shook as she called the police. Within minutes, officers arrived to secure the scene. This is escalating, one of them said, his expression grim. You need to be careful, Mrs. Harper. He's getting desperate. Desperate. The word echoed in Evelyn's mind, solidifying her resolve. The hearing. The day of the hearing arrived. Evelyn dressed in her best, her nerves frayed but her determination unwavering. Naomi and Michael accompanied her for support, sitting beside her in the courtroom as the proceedings began. Caleb's attorney wasted no time painting a picture of a misunderstood father. My client has faced undue harassment and false accusations, the lawyer said smoothly. He loves his children and wants to provide them with the stable home they deserve. Evelyn felt anger bubble in her chest, but she remained composed. When it was her turn to speak, she recounted the events in vivid detail. The abuse Mateo had described, the nights Caleb broke into her home, the fear that haunted the children. Mateo was called to testify. The boy's small frame looked even smaller in the courtroom, but his voice was steady as he described Caleb's violence. Tears filled Evelyn's eyes as she listened, her heart breaking all over again. Laura presented the evidence. Police reports, photographs of the broken window, and statements from Karen Fletcher. Piece by piece, she built a case that painted Caleb as the unfit guardian he was. When the hearing concluded, the judge announced that a decision would be made in the coming days. Evelyn left the courtroom feeling exhausted but hopeful. A sacrifice made. That evening, Evelyn sat with Mateo and Emma in the living room. Mateo leaned against her, his small hand clutching hers tightly. Whatever happens, Evelyn said softly, I want you to know that I'm proud of you. You're so strong, Mateo. And no matter what, I'll always fight for you. Mateo looked up at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else, hope. For the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a glimmer of peace. She didn't know what the judge's decision would be, but she knew one thing for certain. She had given everything she had to protect these children, and she wasn't done fighting yet. The morning of the judge's decision arrived with a cold, biting wind that seemed to seep into Evelyn's very bones. She sat in the courthouse lobby, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Naomi and Michael flanked her on either side, their silent presence a source of comfort. Across the room sat Caleb, his expression unreadable. He was dressed sharply, as if trying to project an image of responsibility, but his clenched jaw and the occasional twitch in his hand betrayed the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. Mateo and Emma were not present, per the court's request, but Evelyn felt their absence like a hollow ache in her chest. She had promised Mateo that she would come back with good news, and now, all she could do was pray that her promise wouldn't be broken. Mrs. Harper? Laura Connor's voice pulled Evelyn from her thoughts. The attorney's calm demeanor was a welcome sight. They're ready for us. Evelyn nodded, standing on shaky legs. Naomi gave her hand a reassuring squeeze before releasing her. The final hearing. The courtroom was silent as the judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern but fair presence, entered and took her seat. She adjusted her glasses, flipping through the thick file in front of her before speaking. This case has weighed heavily on me, the judge began, her tone measured. The welfare of 2 young children is at stake, and both parties have presented compelling arguments. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest. She gripped the edge of the table, every nerve in her body taut. On one hand, the judge continued, we have Mr. Caleb Carson, the children's legal guardian, who claims to have their best interests at heart. However, the evidence presented paints a troubling picture of his behavior. Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his lawyer placing a hand on his arm in a silent gesture to remain composed. On the other hand, we have Mrs. Evelyn Harper, who, despite not being a blood relative, has demonstrated an extraordinary commitment to the well-being of Mateo and Emma. Her actions have shown selflessness and courage, providing these children with the safety and care they so desperately need. Evelyn's breath hitched. She dared not move, not even to glance at Laura, who sat beside her, stoic and composed. After careful consideration, the judge said, her voice firm, I am awarding temporary custody of Mateo and Emma to Mrs. Harper, pending further evaluations and a final review in 6 months. Evelyn's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Relief and joy flooded her senses, mingling with a profound gratitude that left her momentarily speechless. Caleb's lawyer stood abruptly. Your Honor, I must object. Objection overruled, the judge interrupted, her tone sharp. My decision is final. Mr. Carson, you will be required to attend anger management counseling and comply with all court-mandated conditions before any further custody review is considered. Caleb's face twisted with rage, but he said nothing. His lawyer whispered something to him, likely urging restraint, but Evelyn could feel the venom in his glare as he stared at her. The ride home. The drive back to the house was quiet. Naomi sat in the driver's seat, glancing occasionally at Evelyn, whose tear-streaked face was lit with a faint smile. You did it, Mom, Naomi said softly. You really did it. Evelyn shook her head. We did it, she replied. I couldn't have done this without you. When they pulled into the driveway, Evelyn barely had time to open the door before Mateo burst out of the house, his small legs carrying him across the yard. Evelyn, he shouted, throwing himself into her arms. She scooped him up, hugging him tightly. It's okay, sweetheart, she whispered. You're staying here. You're safe. Tears spilled from Mateo's eyes as he clung to her. I knew you'd win, he said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. Evelyn carried him inside, where Emma lay in her crib, cooing softly. She reached down, stroking the baby's cheek as a sense of peace washed over her. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could finally breathe. The car engine rumbled ominously outside the house. Evelyn's breath caught as she peeked through the curtains, her heart hammering in her chest. A black sedan sat parked under the glow of a street lamp. Behind the wheel, she could just make out Caleb's silhouette, motionless but unmistakable. Her mind raced. The court order was clear. Caleb had no legal right to be anywhere near Mateo and Emma. Yet here he was, his very presence a silent challenge to her resolve. Evelyn turned and grabbed her phone, dialing the police. She kept her voice low as she explained the situation. He's outside my house, she said, her words trembling but firm. He's not supposed to be here. Stay inside, ma'am, the dispatcher instructed. An officer is on the way. The confrontation. Evelyn returned to the window, her hands shaking as she watched Caleb step out of the car. He paced along the sidewalk, his movements erratic. Every so often, he glanced toward the house, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. She tightened her grip on the phone, ready to call Naomi if needed. The thought of Caleb trying to force his way in again made her stomach churn, but she refused to let fear consume her. A sudden cry broke through her thoughts. Emma. Evelyn rushed to the nursery, where the baby was squirming in her crib. Mateo stood nearby, wide-eyed and clutching a blanket. Is he here? Mateo asked, his voice trembling. Evelyn knelt in front of him, placing her hands on his shoulders. It's okay, sweetheart, she said, her voice steady. The police are coming. He can't hurt us. But even as she spoke, the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch sent a jolt of terror through her. Evelyn. Caleb's voice boomed, sharp and angry. You think you've won? This isn't over. They're my kids. Evelyn pulled Mateo close, her mind racing. She had to keep him and Emma safe. Take Emma and hide, she whispered to Mateo. Go to the closet and stay quiet, no matter what. I'll handle this. Mateo hesitated, his eyes wide with fear. But do as I say, Evelyn insisted, her voice leaving no room for argument. Now. Mateo scooped up Emma and ran toward the guest room. Evelyn turned back toward the front door, her pulse pounding in her ears. The final stand. The banging on the door grew louder. Evelyn grabbed the heavy lamp from the side table, her weapon of choice on more than one occasion, and stood her ground. Get off my property, she shouted, her voice fierce and unwavering. The police are on their way. Open the door. Caleb roared. You think you can keep them from me? You're nothing. Nothing. Evelyn's grip on the lamp tightened as the door shook under Caleb's fists. She glanced toward the driveway, willing the sound of sirens to fill the air. At last, they came. The unmistakable wail of police cars shattered the night, their flashing lights illuminating the street. Caleb froze, his fists mid-strike. He turned, his face contorted with fury, as two patrol cars screeched to a halt. Officers emerged, guns drawn. Step away from the door, one of them commanded. For a moment, Caleb hesitated, his defiance palpable. But then, with a bitter sneer, he raised his hands. This isn't over, he shouted as the officers handcuffed him. You'll pay for this. Evelyn watched from the window as they led Caleb to one of the patrol cars. Her knees felt weak, but she remained standing, a mixture of relief and exhaustion washing over her. A new beginning. The next morning, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, her hands finally steady. Mateo sat across from her, eating a bowl of cereal, while Emma gurgled happily in her high chair. You did it, Mateo said suddenly, his voice soft but full of admiration. Evelyn looked at him, her heart swelling. No, we did it, she said with a smile. You were brave, Mateo. Braver than most adults I know. The boy blushed, looking down at his bowl. The house felt lighter now, as though Caleb's presence had been a dark cloud that had finally lifted. Evelyn knew there were still challenges ahead, court reviews, counseling for the children, and the long process of healing. But for the first time in weeks, she felt hope. Later that day, Naomi arrived with Michael and their kids, arms full of groceries and gifts. The house buzzed with laughter and warmth as the family gathered around the living room. You've got quite the little team here, Mom, Naomi said, smiling as she watched Mateo play with her youngest. Evelyn nodded, her eyes lingering on Mateo and Emma. They've given me a second chance, she said softly. Naomi placed a hand on her mother's shoulder. And you've given them the same. The promise. That night, Evelyn stood by the crib, watching Emma sleep. Mateo was curled up in bed, the blanket pulled snugly around him. Evelyn leaned down and kissed Emma's forehead, her heart swelling with love. You're safe now, she whispered. She turned to Mateo, brushing a strand of hair from his face. I promise, she said softly, I'll never let anything happen to you or Emma again. As she left the room and turned off the light, Evelyn felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Her quiet retirement had turned into something far greater than she had ever imagined. A chance to rebuild, to protect, and to love. For the first time in a long time, Evelyn looked forward to the future. And this time, she wasn't alone.